Good morning. Who do we have to add to our prayer list? Jay Plunkett. Anyone else in particular? The LSU defense. Go ahead, Chad.
Dear God, thank you for this morning. It's beautiful weather, the way we like it anyway. Thank you, Lord, for this time we get to spend together and study some of your word. I pray, Lord, especially for Jay Plunkett. I pray, Lord, that will comfort him with the strength, and also for Connie and everyone else in his family affected by his well-being. Pray, Lord, that you'll be with Larry and help him to recall things he's prepared for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. We're in the 24th chapter of Isaiah this morning. And I debated a couple different ways to introduce this chapter, but I think I'm going to go with the background first. There are a couple ways to read this. We can either read the chapter 24 as a prophecy about the second coming, or we can read it about the end of Israel. And if you just read it, you can see either one of those implications. Halley compares this, the Isaiah's reading in here, to what we find in Matthew 24. And let's flip over there real quick. I'm just going to read a few verses so that you get the idea of where we are with this reference. Beginning in verse 7, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginnings of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation by all nations on account of my name. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with how that passage continues. And so that's what Halley is thinking. The thing is, you got to remember that Halley is a premillennialist. And so you have to look at it with that context. Clark leans back on that it's a continuation of Isaiah's prophecies in previous chapters, and the destruction of the Jewish nation, leaving only a remnant. This chapter 24 and the next three chapters all seem to have been written about the same time, before the destruction of Moab by Shalmaneser at the beginning of Hezekiah's reign, somewhere around 712 BC. And the reading, like I said, is a continuation of the prophecy of destruction due to disobedience, idolatry, and apostasy. Commentators do disagree on the text. Some of them consider this to be specifically about the invasion of Shalmaneser, some about the invasion by Nebuchadnezzar, and some by the desolation of the country by the Romans. There's one notable exception, and that's the scholar Vitringa. How many of you are familiar with Vitringa? I figured it'd only be one or two. A whole lot more of you will be at least a little bit familiar here in a few minutes. So, Vitringa specifically applies this to the persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek. Okay, so for all of us, Antiochus Epiphanes, he actually changed his name to this, and from the Greek it means God manifest. He was a Greek Hellenistic king who ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC until his death in 164. He was the son of King Antiochus III the Great. Originally named Mithridates, he assumed the name Antiochus after he ascended the throne. Notable, and we'll use notable in parentheses, events during his reign include the near conquest of Ptolemaic Egypt and his persecution of the Jews of Judea and Samaria, and the rebellion of the Jewish Maccabees. Antiochus' accession to the throne was controversial, and he was seen as a usurper by some. After the death of his brother Seleucus IV, Philopator, in 175 BC, the true heir should have been Seleucus' son, Demetrius I. However, Demetrius I was very young and a hostage in Rome at the time, and Antiochus seized the opportunity to declare himself king instead, successfully rallying enough of the Greek ruling class in Antioch to support his claim. This helped set a destabilizing trend in the Seleucid Empire in subsequent generations as an increasing number of claimants tried to usurp the throne. And after his own death, power struggles between competing lines of the ruling dynasty heavily contributed to the collapse of the empire. Okay. So that gives you background on a brief background on Antiochus. Antiochus, though, like it said here, ruled around 160. Okay, the Greek control was even further down into about 105. So to me, there's a little issue there. I want to give you a little bit of background on Vitringa, again, so that you can understand a little bit about this man. He was born in 1659. He was a Dutch Protestant theologian and a Hebraist, the youngest of 4 children. A follower of Johannes Cosius, was a supporter of prophetic theology. He was educated at the universities of Franeker and Leiden and became a professor of Oriental languages at the former in 1681. When locating prophetic outcomes, he would associate events to the near rather than the far-off future, placing a distinct focus on the period of the Maccabees. Like Joseph Meade, Vitringa believed wholeheartedly that the millennium was yet to come, but did not expect any immediate changes. He relegated the end of time to a remote future and strongly emphasized the concept of New Jerusalem. His most important student is considered Herman Venema. Okay, so it gives you a little bit of background on Vitringa. To me, this is a great example why we read commentators with a grain of salt. And here comes my disclaimer. I'm not claiming to be smarter or more educated or endowed with a greater measure of wisdom than this very learned scholar that we just talked about. But this is my logic. The Greek control was down around 100 BC. Given the impending threats of the Assyrians, the previous prophecies of Isaiah, and the promise of the rise of the Medes and Persians directly by Isaiah, the threat of Greeks 600 years down the road just doesn't seem to fit into this logic. Remember, it was Daniel 100 years later that even brought the Greeks and Romans into specific prophecy. So that's why I think that there's a problem with Vitringa's interpretation. So the terminology in this chapter is very generalistic and could very easily apply to all 3 of the previous desolations, Shalmaneser, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Romans. But the Romans destroyed the temple around 70, 75 AD, somewhere in that time frame. Okay? Far after the other 2 destructions. And what was the real result of the destruction of the temple? It was not the scattering of the Jews, it was the scattering of the church. It forced the church to leave that area and go abroad and spread the word. So to apply this prophecy to the Romans, again, seems inconsistent with Isaiah's other prophecies. The scattering of the church itself would have meant nothing to Isaiah, because, again, Isaiah was very rooted in a remnant of Jerusalem, and the Jews continuing as Jews throughout time. And so, again, that's why, to me, you discount the Romans and the Greeks, and that it comes back to what makes a whole lot more sense, the invasions of Shalmaneser and or Nebuchadnezzar. Sir? Yeah. Yeah. So again, I don't claim to be smart. I just think that he wasn't correct in his conclusion. Okay. All right. Now let's get into the chapter. Now that you've heard my 2 cents and we've gotten hopefully a little bit of background on the chapter, let's read through it and then we'll go back into it. Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like her mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken his word. The earth mourns and withers, the world fades and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth fade away. The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. The new wine mourns, the vine decays. All the merry-hearted sigh, the gaiety of tambourines ceases. The noise of revelers stops, the gaiety of the harp ceases. They do not drink wine with song. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. The city of chaos is broken down. Every house is shut up so that none may enter. There is an outcry in the streets concerning the wine. All the joy turns to gloom. The gaiety of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city, and the gate is battered to ruins. For thus it will be in the midst of the earth among the peoples, and the shaking of an olive tree, as the gleanings when the grape harvest is over. They raise their voices, they shout for joy. They cry out from the west concerning the majesty of the Lord. Therefore, glorify the Lord in the east, the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, in the coastlands of the sea. From the ends of the earth we hear songs, glory to the righteous one. But I say, woe to me, alas for me. The treacherous deal treacherously, and the treacherous deal very treacherously. Terror and pit and snare confront you, O inhabitant of the earth. Then it will be that he who flees the report of disaster will fall into the pit, and he who climbs out of the pit will be caught in the snare. For the windows above are opened, and the foundations of the earth shake. The earth is broken asunder, the earth is split through, the earth is shaken violently. The earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and it totters like a shack, for its transgression is heavy upon it, and it will fall, never to rise again. So it will happen in that day that the Lord will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth on earth. And they will be gathered together like prisoners in the dungeon, and will be confined in prison. After many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. Okay, so I think you can see why, if you have a premillennialist view, that you may assign this to the second coming. Again, though, it's just not in context with Isaiah. Okay, so let's go back and get into it. First off, does anybody have any questions or comments before we get into the chapter, into tearing the chapter apart? Okay.
Premillennial, that's like basically Jesus reigns on earth after the 70 years.
For 1,000 years, and
Right,
yeah,
1,000 years reign.
yeah. One interpretation from it, yes. Okay. So, if we coming back to the beginning of the chapter, we have a reference back to Jeremiah 51:64 that kind of runs parallel with this. You have it starting off, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface. And in Jeremiah, so will Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster I will bring on her, and her people will fall. The words of Jeremiah end here. It's interesting because that's not the end of Jeremiah. Jeremiah goes on for another chapter or two. The interpretation of that is basically there's no argument from what I read. So I thought that was interesting. The New Jerusalem Bible reads, thus far the words of Jeremiah. It kind of clarifies that thought. Okay. Verse 4, the earth mourns and winters, the world fades and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth fade away. Okay. In here, the world is the same as the land. It's referring to Jerusalem, Jerusalem and Judah. Again, Isaiah's context, he's dealing with the destruction of the Jewish people here. And so that's what the reference comes back to. Verse 5. The earth is polluted by its inhabitants. Okay, so who's the inhabitants? All the people. For they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Okay. Clark says that if this read singularly as broke the law, that it would be referring to the Torah. But because it's in plural, there's a couple things in here. Clark reads it as the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Chaldee, okay, which different sets of laws, and the plural. Yeah, I thought that was interesting, too, in that Isaiah would be referring to Chaldean law. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, the natural laws, basically. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, actually. Again, this is why you read commentators with a grain of salt. Barnes says that they've broken of the everlasting covenant in the sense of the law by the term everlasting covenant. Vitringa supposes that it denotes the laws of nature, the immutable laws of justice and right, which are engraven on the conscience and which are inflexible and perpetual. Benson says it's the covenant made between God and Abraham and all his posterity, which was everlasting, both on God's part, who upon the conditions therein expressed engaged himself to be a God to them and to their seed forever, and on Israel's part, who were obligated thereby to constant and perpetual obedience through all nations. Jameson Fawcett Brown says laws, ordinance, everlasting covenant, the moral laws, positive statutes, the natural covenant designed to be forever between God and them. So that you have these commentators all across the board. Personally, I think it has to do with the natural laws, those laws that were given to all men, whether you were a Jew or not, because of this context in that the laws were broken. And if you look at everything that's going on, it's not just idolatry. Think of the other things that you read going on in the Old Testament. It's pedophilia, it's homosexuality, it's murder, it's all of these things that were violated. Okay? And so I think that's what Isaiah is referring to, is a violation of these natural laws that came about after the flood that God set down. Yeah, and all of that existed before Abraham. Yeah. So I thought it was interesting that these very educated scholars were not able to come back to that conclusion. So, any other comments? I thought that was a fascinating section in here that Isaiah would make reference to. Part of the reason for the destruction was the violation of all peoples by these laws. But if you think about it, Isaiah has prophesied against the Assyrians, he's prophesied against the Babylonians, against the Medes and Persians, against the Judaites, against Jerusalem. He's prophesied against all of them because they've all violated these laws. So, yeah. And as we go through this, I want you to keep in mind the context that Isaiah was firmly convinced that the remnant of Judea and Jerusalem would always be Jewish. And I think that's an important inflection on how we look at his prophecies.
One more quick thought.
Mhm.
And it's imperative that we remember that. Go all the way back to many other stories in the Bible, all the examples that you and Wade have talked about over the many months in the past here that we've talked about how different individuals, whether it be a king or a leader of a nation that oppressed the Israelites. Nevertheless, the bottom line is that God still didn't care. Go back to the story of Jonah. God sent Jonah to Nineveh. Nineveh was not a descendant or descendants of Abraham, and yet God cared about them enough to offer them the opportunity to repent.
Yep.
So I think we need to keep that in mind because it's imperative that we recognize that every single soul matters to God.
Yep. Nineveh's a great example. With the Jews being the chosen people, though, how do we know that God had always had the door open for everyone? Before that, Bobby. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We are. But how do we know that back in this time, the door was still open to anyone that would obey?
Rahab, you're talking about.
Just in general terms, how do we know that?
I mean, people did convert to
There you go.
Judaism.
There you go. There was always a door open for proselytes, wasn't there?
Yeah, it talks about the alien and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. People were allowed to convert to Judaism.
That's right. No, no, no. But to Clayton's point, the door has always been open. The door mandated obedience. And in this time frame, it mandated obedience back to the circumcision and compliance with the old law, didn't it? And now, with the new law.
In fact, if you could go back to when Abraham was sojourning through the wilderness and he met Melchizedek, the king and high priest of Salem, who was a high priest of God, Jehovah God, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God did not choose Abraham and his descendants because they were the only people he cared about. He chose them for a purpose, a mission, and a demonstration to us today that historically speaking, we can look back at the historical records in the Old Testament that you're teaching us and demonstrate that man cannot follow a hard and fast law and spend eternity in heaven with God.
Yep. We know for what purpose Abraham was chosen, obviously. The interesting thing is that, which I think is kind of important for us today too, is that we have no idea what he did to gain that favor. In other words, his works, his acts were irrelevant. God chose Abraham because of his heart, because he found favor in God, and chose him for that purpose. And I think that's an interesting lesson for us too. It's not what we do, it's who we are. So, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And now you start to see these things all tie together when you look in a bigger picture, don't you? To me, it's amazing how when you dig into these kind of things and then you step back, you see all of the steps fall right in place. And now you understand why James wrote what he wrote. So, thank you. All right. Verse 6. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and those that live in it are held guilty. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. And again, you see Isaiah coming back to this remnant. And he's going to constantly talk about this remnant and about how few are going to be left. Verse 8. The gaiety of the tambourine ceases, the noise of the reveler stops. What I read was the interpretation of this noise is actually the pride. A person's pride will cease. The gaiety of the harp, this paints a picture of people dancing in the streets. And it's basically the end of this. Okay. What was interesting, though, the King James uses noise. I'm sorry, King James, I think, uses pride, if I'm reading my notes right. The New Jerusalem Bible reads sounds. No, it doesn't. It reads noise. I have to stop and think my notes here as I go through them. Actually, none of the 31 translations uses the word pride, which was strange. Sir? Revelers, yeah. Partiers, partygoers. Yep. The strong drink. This strong drink was palm wine. And when I read that, I'm going, So I can go to Google. Palm wine is a white sap from any one of several different palm trees. And it is sweet. It's collected very much the same way that we collect maple syrup from tapping a tree. It begins to ferment immediately due to wild yeast in the air, and they also supposed yeast that was left over in the containers. It's distilled in many regions to yield a drink of about 40% alcohol. However, it doesn't last at all. Within a couple days, it's turned to vinegar, from what I read. So, and that may be some of the irony in this passage about the strong drink being bitter, is that it's spoiled, and all of the partying and all of the pride and all of this has spoiled, basically. Yeah. Okay. Verse 11. There's an outcry in the streets concerning the wine. All the joy turns to gloom, and the gaiety of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city. The King James has darkened in there, if I remember right, and it reads passed away. And the translations are split in their reading. Some of the commentators talk about crying for wine, essentially to get drunk, to forget the distress and calamity that are facing, the revelers that's being spoken of. Some talk about the wine that's left in the field, but is unable to be harvested and produced because of the persecution that's going on, the destruction that's going on. They don't have the time and the ability to do that. Matthew Henry, however, puts an interesting twist on it. He associates this thought with those that lay up their treasures in earthly things. I thought, that's an interesting take. I don't know how much I could really support it from this, but it's an interesting take nonetheless. And I guess if you put it in line with crying out for some way to disassociate yourself from reality, I guess those two things could tie together. So. Verse 13 and 14. The shaking of an olive tree, the gleanings of the grape harvest is over. We've talked about this before. What is the shaking of the olive tree? What happens when you shake the olive tree?
Olives fall.
Olives fall. What also happens? Not all of them fall, okay? And no matter how hard you shake it, not all of them fall. So again, this is Isaiah going back into using this picture and the gleanings from the grapevines. Who's grown grapes or muscadines? Do they all get ripe at the same time? Grapes or muscadines? Has anybody else grown them? They don't all get ripe at the same time. So you go through and you harvest them, and the next morning what? there's more that are ripe. Okay, that's the picture that's here of the gleanings, is that the harvest comes through and there are a few left, just like with the shaking of the olive tree. And again, Isaiah's kind of reflecting on this remnant that will always be there. They sing for the majesty of the Lord, those that are left. Okay. Obviously, it's not those that didn't make it through the sifting of the remnant. It's those that did survive the remnant. That most of what is being spoken of is those that left Jerusalem and fled to other parts, to Egypt, Asia Minor, the islands and the coast of Greece, and Alexandria. I'm going to read those locations again. Most of them fled to Egypt, Asia Minor, and the islands and the coast of Greece. What does that sound like? This was another thing that caught my attention. I thought, that's interesting. Can I get some help passing these out real quick? Okay, now that you're looking at the map, do these regions sound familiar? I'm sorry? Here, see it? Yep. Yeah. Look at where Paul ran his missionary journeys. Pretty much throughout these same regions. We're going to get to that. Thank you. But I thought how interesting. Isaiah talks about Judea and Jerusalem being scattered and fleeing to areas, and then 700 years later, Paul goes to basically these same areas to preach the word. Yeah. So what is really interesting and semi-ironic about this? Paul is known as the apostle to whom? To the Gentiles, isn't he? But yet he aimed and started off going strictly into synagogues to preach to the Jews first. Yeah. Yeah. Remember what I said my theme for this study was going to be at the beginning? Shows you how much you pay attention. Well, I wrote it down. John 3:16. For God so loved the world. Okay. This is why I chose that as a theme. As you start to see these pieces come together. Isaiah is talking about the destruction, basically, of the Jewish nation, and then 700 years later, you see Paul taking the word to these same people who were scattered. Okay? We're going to see that thought actually basically be stated here in this chapter as we get to the end.
You read the Great Commission, you know exactly what Jesus said. We're not saying make it only be these people, or make it only
Yeah.
this region, but rather
Yeah.
everyone, the whole world.
Yep. But the part that struck me is the direct tie for someone that was a Pharisee of Pharisees. And then he goes to virtually these same locales. So, Well, if you caught it when I was reading about Vitringa, he was very much sold on a new Jerusalem, which means he was convinced of the old law as well. So, okay. Verse 15. Therefore glorify the Lord in the east, the name of the Lord and the God of Israel in the coastlands of the sea. There's two versions that use fires in here. The King James is one, and Webster's. Islands in the valleys refer to the cities, because most of the cities were usually built in valley areas or on coastlands. And the fires, if I remember right, referred to the light more than anything else, not the actual burning. Verse 16 has an interesting twist here. It looks as if Isaiah is speaking in the first person of someone that was not part of the remnant that left, but part that stayed. And so he talks about, woe to me, alas for me. The treacherous deal treacherously, and the treacherous deal very treacherously. So it's just kind of like almost a self-reflection here for a moment. 17, basically through the end of the chapter, talks about continued tribulations. And what's interesting is there is a reference here to Amos. And turn to Amos 5. And I'm going to start with verse 18. Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. What will the day of the Lord be for you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be like a man who flees from a lion only to encounter a bear, or who enters his house and rests his hand against the wall only to be bitten by a snake. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness and not light, even gloom with no brightness in it? Okay. That's kind of the same thought process that's going in here. And what's interesting is that Isaiah uses pictures, not similes, but uses descriptions here that are hunting descriptions. So he talks about the snare and the terror and the pit. The one thing I found interesting is terror here was a long string of feathers, brightly colored feathers, that would have been drawn across a narrow draw area. So when they were chasing animals, because they can't sit in their heated deer stand with plexiglass windows and with a 30-06 and hit them at 300 yards, they had to chase these animals down. And so they would chase them to an area that narrowed down so that they could control them. And these feathers would be strung across, and the feathers would flap and be in different colors. It would scare and disorient the animals, enabling them to capture them. So that's where this terror comes from. And then, of course, pits and snares. And you hear this screaming. Very seldom is an animal killed by actually falling into the pit or being entrapped by the snare. It essentially just demobilizes them until the hunters can come up on them. And so you hear this screaming that's being described here. If you can picture an animal that's in pain, that's what he's talking about people, about the Jews in this time frame. They got nowhere to go. Every time they think they get away from one trap, another trap gets them. And this, So, okay. Well, I hate to rush through the last of it, but we're going to see what we can do. Verse 20, it refers to the earth. Oh, that's interesting. New American Standard doesn't use the same, unless I've got the wrong verse. Talks about a shanty or a cottage. The thought process, though, is that it's a temporary residence. So Isaiah talks about the earth as a temporary residence. Verse 21. The hosts on heaven on high and the kings of the earth on earth. It was interesting. There's only a couple versions that specifically refer to this as fallen angels. Most of the versions remain very cryptic in these descriptions. They're pretty consistent in that the kings of the earth refer to the Jewish religious hierarchy. But the heavens on how's that? The host on high remains very cryptic. I don't have an answer for that one. It'd be easy to conclude that it's a general reference as a whole to the Jewish hierarchy, but it'd also be easy to include those that disobeyed God in heaven at the same time. And the problem is that this is where some of the references to a second coming are probably drawn. So, yeah, yeah. Like I said, almost all of them remain very cryptic in this, and I don't have a good explanation for it, and I couldn't come across one. I'm open to anybody and everybody who is far wiser than I am that would have 2 cents to throw in there. Okay, that's pretty bad when you're shaking your head. Okay. Yeah, that's the passage that I was referring to. Yeah. I think King James said cottage. I think the New Jerusalem said shanty. But the whole idea is that it was a flimsy, temporary residence. So. This chapter ends up on an incredibly positive note. Verse 22 and 23, where it talks about they will be gathered together like prisoners in the dungeon and confined in prison. After many days they will be punished, then the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed. The King James includes in there will be visited. I'm not sure why the New American Standard leaves that part out. But the practice of despot monarchs was to throw people that they didn't like into a dungeon and basically turn around and leave them and forget about them. Yeah. So they were left to live out their lives, much like Paul was done, left to live out their lives in a cold, dank hole in the ground with no hope and no chance of any kind of reconciliation. The picture here, though, is that that's the picture of the punishment for the Jews in the nation being destroyed. But God says, unlike that, he says, I'll come back and visit them. So you see the Jews being scattered, the Jewish nation being destroyed. You see the rebellion of the Maccabees. And then you see what? 30 more seconds. Bobby, then you see what? Birth of Christ, right? God comes back to visit them. Okay? And that's what I found was so very positive. And I know that Isaiah didn't know it was going to be Christ, but he did know that God was going to come back to visit them. And so that's how that chapter ends. Well, if God comes back to visit and it's Christ, it's the birth of the church, it's not really the second ending. It's the ending of the old law. But yeah. Yeah. It certainly helps to understand why a premillennialist would come to that conclusion. So, Bobby, would you close for me?